This isn't just a testimony, it's a life-changing journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, truth, and freedom. My name is Sadika. Today I speak as a woman who has walked through shadows and seen light, but my journey began when I was only a small girl of 9 years old. I was born to a Christian family, far from the hills of Afghanistan where I would later live. My parents loved Jesus, and even though we were few in number, our home was filled with songs, prayers, and quiet strength. One night, everything changed. I remember waking up to screams and fire. Men with covered faces entered our home. They carried guns and shouted words I did not understand at the time. My father tried to protect us, but he was struck down. My mother held me close, crying and praying under her breath. But she too fell, and in that moment, my world shattered. I was dragged out of the house, small and trembling, hearing the echo of my parents' voices fading into the night. The men who captured me were led by a man who I later came to know as the father of Minkelu. Minkelu was only 11 then, 2 years older than I was, but he stood near his father watching me with wide eyes. That night they took me to their house, a large mud brick home built into a quiet hillside far away from the main town. Around us were about 15 or 20 other houses scattered on the slopes, almost like a hidden village. I did not know it at that time, but every one of those houses belonged to men who were fighters, men who called themselves Allah's warriors. I had no choice but to live there. Everything I had known, my parents, my church, my freedom, was gone. Yet, deep inside, though I did not understand why, I felt that Jesus was still with me. I did not know how, but I kept whispering the prayers my parents taught me, even when no one could hear. It was in that strange and fearful new world that my story of captivity began. As the years passed in that hillside village, I slowly began to understand the life I had been forced into. Every home around us belonged to men who fought in what they called a holy war. They left often, sometimes for weeks, and the women stayed behind to cook, fetch water, and raise children. I was the youngest among them and often stayed quiet, observing, learning what I must do to survive. When I turned 12, the man who led the raid on my family, Minkelu's father, decided I would be married to his son. I remember the day he announced it. The women clapped their hands softly, and I was dressed in borrowed clothes that did not fit me. My heart trembled. I was still a child. I had never understood what marriage meant, only that I would now belong to Minkelu as his wife. Minkelu was only 14 then. He was not cruel like his father, but he had grown up believing that their way was the only truth. He followed his father to training camps, learned to fight, and repeated prayers that I could never understand. I lived in fear, moving through each day as though I were walking on thin ice. I cooked, washed, and obeyed. But every night when everyone slept, I whispered quietly to Jesus, asking him to remember me. 1 year later, Minkelu's father was killed during a raid. I remember the night the men brought his body home. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and grief. Minkelu stood by his father's body, his face hard but his eyes lost. That night, I saw something change in him. He became colder, quieter. He started leading the men to battles himself, just as his father did. I was left alone for days at a time. Sometimes the other wives would gather together and talk about their fears. Some missed their families. Some had forgotten their real names. I still remembered mine, though I never said it aloud. They called me Sadika, the name they gave me when I was captured. But in my heart, I held tightly to the name my parents gave me, as though keeping it alive would keep me connected to who I truly was. Every night, before I slept, I prayed. I asked Jesus to show me if he still saw me. Many times I dreamt of a bright light that shone through a cave, and I would wake up crying, feeling peace I could not explain. Deep within me, I began to believe that one day, somehow, he would bring me out of that place of darkness. As time went by, I began to see things more clearly. I noticed that every man who lived on that hillside was a fighter. They called themselves protectors of their faith, but their faith brought fear and death wherever they went. The hillside that had seemed so quiet was not a village, it was a camp of terrorists. When the men went out on missions, their wives gathered together. It was the only time we could speak freely. Some of them had babies tied to their backs, others had older children who played outside with sticks shaped like guns. I listened as they talked about the raids, about the men they had lost, and about the fear that never left them. They lived in obedience to their husbands but had no joy. Their eyes were tired, their smiles forced. In those moments, I realized how different I was inside. Even though I was trapped like them, my heart still whispered to Jesus. I remembered the Bible stories my parents used to tell me, about Daniel in the lion's den, and about Paul and Silas in prison. I began to see myself as one of them, locked away, but still seen by God. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I dreamt again of a light breaking through a mountain cave. In my dreams, I was running with other women, and behind us, fire burned. I always woke up breathless but hopeful. Slowly, a seed of courage began to grow in me. I thought of the other women, the ones who cried at night, the ones who whispered about wanting freedom but were too afraid to try. I started speaking to them, quietly at first. I told them there was a different life beyond the hillside, a life without fear. I didn't mention Jesus directly because that could cost my life, but I told them about peace, about forgiveness, and about hope that comes from the one who gives light even in darkness. One of them, a woman named Lamia, said to me one evening, "If I ever get the chance, I will run, even if I must leave my children behind." Her eyes were full of pain when she said that. Others nodded, though they dared not speak. That was when I knew I was not the only one dreaming of freedom. Still, I was careful. The men could never know that such thoughts existed among us. I learned to keep my face calm, my voice quiet, but inside, I was praying more than ever. I began to ask Jesus not only to save me but to save the other women too, those whose hearts were breaking under the weight of their chains. I didn't know when or how, but I began to believe that one day, something would happen, something that would open the way for us to escape. It started quietly, just whispers between chores. When the men were away and the children played outside, we women would gather around a small fire behind one of the houses. There were 6 of us in total, and though none of us could speak openly about faith, I knew that each one of us carried deep pain and longing for freedom. If you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love for you to be part of this journey. Our community is growing, and it's filled with people who, like you, are searching for truth and hope. As you listen, we'd love for you to be part of this moment. Tell us where you're watching from, and share what speaks to your heart. Your words don't just fill the comment section. They can spark hope, ignite faith, and remind someone else that God's love is real and still at work today. I remember their faces clearly. Lamia, strong but broken, always watching the hills as if expecting a miracle. Nazira, the youngest among them after me, with eyes that had forgotten how to smile. Fatima, who had lost her husband in one of the raids and was forced to marry another man. Then there was Maryam and Halima, older women who tried to comfort us, even while their own hearts were weary. Together, we formed a quiet circle of hope. I began to share small pieces of what I believed. I told them that there was a God who saw even the smallest tear, a God who could set people free from fear. I spoke carefully, using words that would not draw suspicion. But in my heart, I knew I was telling them about Jesus, the same Jesus who had kept me alive since the night I lost my parents. Sometimes I would dream again, dreams so vivid they felt real. In one of them, I saw myself walking out of a dark cave, and behind me were the same 5 women, carrying their children. The path ahead was bright and led down the hill toward a light that looked like a sunrise. When I woke up from that dream, I felt peace and strength. I told the women about it, and though they didn't understand everything, it gave them hope. We began to meet more often. We shared stories, fears, and small bits of laughter that reminded us we were still human. We also made small plans, what we would do if the men ever left for a long battle again, which direction we could take, how to find food on the way. We didn't have a map or a real plan, but we had faith, or at least I did, and I hoped my faith could carry them too. Many times, the men returned home wounded. They would be treated by a woman doctor who had been captured long before I arrived. She was silent, with eyes full of sadness, but gentle in her work. I often helped her clean the wounds. Watching her work reminded me that even in captivity, some people still tried to bring healing where there was pain. Each time I saw blood and broken bodies, I felt a deep stirring in me. I knew this life was not what God wanted for anyone. I would whisper inside, "Jesus, please make a way." It became my daily prayer. And then one night, He answered, not in words, but in a dream that was clearer and stronger than all the others before it. I saw myself leading those same women and their children down a narrow path at night, with the moon lighting the way. We were running, not from fear, but toward freedom. When I woke up, I knew the time was close. The night after that dream felt different. The air around the hillside was unusually still, and the men were restless. They gathered near the meeting tent, their voices low and serious. Later that evening, our husbands called all the women together. For the first time, I saw them all standing as one, about 20 men, armed and dressed in dark clothing. Minkelu, my husband, stepped forward. He spoke firmly, telling us that they were leaving for a special operation against foreign soldiers and that we should keep praying for them. His eyes looked proud, but I sensed fear behind them. I watched him walk away into the night with the others, their shadows disappearing into the forest. When the men were gone, silence filled the hillside. The children slept, and the women waited, expecting their husbands to return by morning. But the morning came, and no one appeared. We waited the whole day, our hearts growing heavy. As evening fell again, a wounded man stumbled back into the camp. His clothes were torn, and blood ran down his leg. The women gathered around him, and he told us in a weak voice that the battle had gone terribly wrong. Almost all the men, including Minkelu, were dead. He had only survived because he fled the battlefield. He looked at us and said, "Leave this place. It is no longer safe. The soldiers will come." That night, fear and confusion filled the air. The women wept, some for their husbands, others from the shock of freedom they didn't ask for. But as I looked around at them, I remembered my dream. I felt a quiet voice inside me saying, "Now is the time." I gathered the 5 women who had shared my secret hope. We sat together, trembling, and I told them that this was our chance, that we must go before the soldiers or other fighters came. At first, they hesitated, but when I reminded them of our late-night talks and the dreams we'd shared, they agreed. Before we left, I looked one last time at the house I had lived in for years, the same place where I had cried and prayed. I whispered a prayer of thanks and asked Jesus to go before us. With 6 women and 8 children, we began walking down the hillside under the dim moonlight. We didn't know where the road would lead, but I knew in my heart that freedom was waiting ahead. The path down the hillside was rough and covered with stones. The children were tired, but we took turns carrying them. We walked through the cold night, stopping only when the younger ones began to cry. The mountains around us echoed with strange sounds, but we kept moving. Each step felt like a prayer. Sometimes I thought I saw lights far away, maybe soldiers' camps, maybe villages, but we avoided them, hiding whenever we heard noise. At dawn, we reached a stream and drank water from our hands. The women were exhausted, and some wanted to turn back, afraid of what might happen if we were caught. But I told them that we could not return to chains. I reminded them that our husbands were gone and that this was our only chance to live. Inside, I felt weak too, but there was something stronger than fear carrying me: faith. I believed that Jesus was guiding every step we took. As we continued walking, I saw small signs of life: a goat's footprint, smoke rising in the far distance, a broken fence. Those signs gave me hope that we were nearing a village. We walked for hours until the sun was high, and finally, we saw a small road leading into a valley. There, hidden among trees, was a church building. It was old and partly damaged, but the sight of it made my heart leap. It was the same church where my parents used to worship before the raid. We approached slowly, unsure if it was safe. I told the women to wait while I went ahead. My heart beat fast as I stepped inside. The sound of people praying met my ears, and tears filled my eyes. After so many years, I was standing again in a house of worship. When I entered the church, everyone turned to look at me. They saw my torn clothes, my tired face, and the women waiting behind me with their children. A man who looked like the pastor came forward. I didn't recognize him. The pastor I remembered from my childhood was older, but when I told him my parents' names and what had happened, his eyes widened. He called the elders, and soon people began to weep. They remembered my family. They remembered the night of the raid. I told them everything, how I had been taken, how my parents were killed, how I had lived among the terrorists for years, and how we escaped. The church people listened quietly, some with tears in their eyes. When I finished, the pastor laid his hand on my shoulder and said that Jesus had truly kept me alive for a reason. They took all of us in, the 6 women and the 8 children, and gave us food, clean clothes, and a place to sleep. For the first time in many years, I slept without fear. In the days that followed, the church helped us heal. The women began to open their hearts to faith, asking questions about the God who had rescued us. The children smiled again. I often sat quietly, remembering the long nights of prayer in the hills and how God had answered them. The pastor said that our story was proof that no darkness is too deep for God's light to reach. One morning, I stood outside the church and looked toward the hills. They were far away now, fading behind the morning mist. I whispered softly, "Thank you, Jesus. You brought me out." I knew then that I was no longer Sadika, the name given to me by those who captured me, but Jael, the name my parents had given me, the name that meant strength. I moved back into my parents' old house. The church members helped repair it, and soon it became a warm place again. Sometimes I sat by the window, watching the hills in the distance and remembering the faces of those still trapped there. My heart ached for them, but I prayed that one day they too would find freedom. The 5 women stayed close. They began to learn more about Jesus. Together we prayed, sang simple songs, and read the Bible. Some of them cried when they learned that God forgives even the worst pasts, that they were not cursed or forgotten, but deeply loved. The children laughed and played around us, their laughter sounding like music to my ears. Life was not easy. We had to rebuild from nothing, and many people in nearby villages didn't trust us because of where we had come from. But I knew that God had not saved us to live in fear again. I worked hard, helping at the church and teaching the children songs my mother once taught me. Each day I thanked God for freedom, for life, and for hope that does not die. Sometimes at night I still dream, not of fire or war anymore, but of light. In those dreams, I walk beside Jesus, and he reminds me that every tear I cried in the hills was not forgotten. He lets me know that pain was not wasted. It became the path that led me to him. As time went on, my story spread among believers in nearby villages. People came to hear how God had delivered a woman once trapped among those who fought against his people. Some came in tears, others came in silence. I told them everything honestly, not to make myself great, but to show that God's mercy reaches even into the darkest caves. There were times when I wondered why God allowed me to suffer so much as a child, but as I looked at the women and children who now had new lives, I began to understand. If my life had remained comfortable, I might never have known what it means to fully depend on him. Through suffering, he revealed his glory. Through loss, he gave me a new purpose. Now, whenever I speak to young girls in the church, I tell them to treasure their faith. I remind them that real strength is not in weapons or war but in love and forgiveness. I tell them that God still speaks, still saves, still guides. Sometimes I see the same spark in their eyes that I once had as a little girl sitting by the fire while my parents prayed. It fills me with peace. And even when I remember the pain of my past, I feel no hatred for Minkelu. I only pray that God had mercy on his soul, for he, too, was a captive of lies. Now, as I share my story, I am no longer that frightened 9-year-old girl. I am Jael, a woman who has seen what faith can do. My life has taught me that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the clearest light. There were nights I thought I would die, but those nights became the roots of my faith. I have learned that God's timing is perfect, even when it feels late. To every believer who hears my story, I say, never let go of hope. When life becomes painful, when prayers seem unanswered, remember that God is still working. The same Jesus who found me in a terrorist camp can find anyone, anywhere. No prison is too strong, no night too dark, no heart too lost for His love.